So, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you joining us from the West Coast. Thank you for attending today's webinar. As you may know, my name is Victoria Thacker, and I will be your host for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, webinars, or events, I do invite you to visit our website at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Now, before we begin this presentation, just like normal, I just want everybody to note that everyone has been muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function or note them in the chat, and I will flag them for our speaker. We do have a couple points in this presentation that are a little bit more interactive, so if at any point you want to join in the conversation, please feel free to use the chat. It should be open for everybody to use. You can also ask your questions, as I say, in the Q&A. And if you'd like to participate like as a one-off, you can also raise your hand and we can give you the ability to talk during the presentation. So with all of that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Asha Burry, who will be presenting on managing difficult organizational change. Asha brings over 30 years of experience in human resources, business, and operations, and currently serves as head of human resources for Owens Corning, Canada. She is also a doctoral student at Royal Roads University with academic credentials, including a Master of Human Resources, a CHRL designation, and degrees in economics. Beyond her professional work, Asha is vice chair of the board and chair of the governance committee for the charity Unsinkable and supports young women in skilled trades through her work with Jill of All Trades. So with all of that, please join me in welcoming Asha Burry.
So thank you very much. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Good. Okay, well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here and so excited to be chatting with you all today, and to be talking about managing difficult organizational change. So, with that, I'd like to first of all welcome you all here, and if you don't mind in the chat, I see some of you already have. I'm talking to you here from just north of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. And I was just wondering, I see we've got, thank you. I think Heidi started off with wishing us good morning from Vancouver and BC and also in Canada. And we have, so I think it's Sophia from Barbados. So just wondering if you wanted to share with everybody where you're calling in from. Good morning or good afternoon, Dean from Windsor. St. Catharines, Ontario. I was just there the other day. Yes, wonderful. And from Vancouver, Alberta, Toronto. Lots of people from Canada, Vancouver. Good afternoon from Ontario as well. Yeah, we're getting beautiful weather in Ontario. Burnaby. Okay. Well, welcome all. And very, very glad to see you here. So that was a very, Victoria gave me a very kind of wonderful introduction. Just to round it out, I definitely have a number of years in HR. I started very young, I'd like to say. And again, my educational background has been in not only human resources, but in economics. And I'm currently in my second year of the doctoral program. I've had my experience has been quite interesting because not only have I had experience in the HR field, but I've had the opportunity to work in operations, actually manufacturing operations, and also to business management. So it's been an interesting ride. I was very much involved in a number of mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and plant closures. It is from all of there that I come to you today with some experience on managing difficult change. So with that, if you don't mind sharing with me and with each other, what brings you here today to talk about managing difficult organizational change? What is it about this webinar And I'm very thankful you did pick it. But what is it about this webinar that made you interested to attend today? If you don't mind just putting it in the chat. Yes, there's lots of uncertainty, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Thank you very much for bringing that up, Patricia. And currently, oh yes, you're undergoing a merger. Yes, a lot of that happening. There's a lot of condensing in the market too. Okay, reduce funding. Yep, that is definitely a point. Change is a constant. Yes, absolutely. There's so many changes. We'll talk a little bit about that of why it is a constant and what we're seeing out there. And you never know what you will face in this situation. This is absolutely true, Sarah. Okay, undergoing a change of control. Yes, absolutely. So let's that. Thank you very much for sharing. Sharing some of some of your interests today. So, as we discussed and as you mentioned, as organizations face mounting pressure to adapt to global political and economic changes, the topic of managing organizational change is becoming increasingly crucial. Yes, handling difficult conversations with influence. Thank you very much. That's an excellent point. AI integration, and this is, again, I was just about to say, technological advancements, market shifts, and regulatory changes all necessitate us to make decisions and manage through difficult changes. Understanding the dynamic relationship between the employer and the employee and navigating through these organizational changes are critical to the last point about handling difficult conversations. So today we're going to do three things. We're going to examine the dynamic relationship between the employer and the employee during negatively perceived organizational changes. We're going to discuss the key components of creating a smooth transition through change for both the employer and the employee, particularly focusing on communication. And then we're going to explore the psychological implications of the employee and employer relationship. At the end, I'm going to take all of our learnings and I'm going to share a case study with you, an unpublished paper that some of the findings that we had, and that really brings in all these different components and actually speaks to, very interestingly, some of the changes that I believe that you yourself are going through based on these comments that I'm seeing. Okay. So let's get a little interactive. What are some of the changes that you're seeing? And this could be changes in the economy. We're from around the world right now. I'm seeing the places, or even provincially. What are some of the changes that you're seeing in either it could be the economy or specifically your own company? And you can feel free to put it in the chat. I invite you to put that, any comments or any changes that you're seeing. I think somebody said job architecture changes. That's very interesting. Yes, absolutely. We're going to actually touch on that too. Staff reductions. Yes. Yes, that is happening. Takeovers. There's a lot of condensing in the market and takeovers. We hear about them every day. Okay, frictions around RTO. Okay, global tariffs. Yes, absolutely. That is always number one in the news these days. So many of us are keeping an eye on that. So there's a lot of changes happening right now. And so let's look at it from a global standpoint first. So there's tons of there's tons of information out there. So I just from an economic thought leader, I pulled out this one small excerpt from Deloitte's chief economist on the economy outlook for this summer. And you're seeing words here like global policy uncertainty, impacting global forecasting. Words like downgrading are being used. Failing consumer and business confidence. We're seeing disruptive trade flows, as we've just talked about in the chat. We're expecting expectations of higher costs, financial market volatility, and we're expecting depressed spending and investment. And then in this summer edition, the chief economist starts to talk a little bit about the Canadian economy in particular, but we're seeing the impact globally. So now that we've taken a look at the overall economy, and we're all very much aware of what's going on from an overall global economy, let's look at how this impacts you, how it impacts you as a governance professional and from a governance standpoint. So here is the Chartered Governance Institute's international president address in July 2024, when we started to see, let me change the slide, when we started to see some uncertainty. And I'd like to point out here that the Institute itself is engaging in organizational change to equip its members, governance professionals, to navigate through difficult and vital governance ship that you guys are going to have to navigate through as we go through all of these market uncertainties and and economic uncertainties, global uncertainties. Specifically here, I want to point out some of the quote here, that given some political and market pressures to adopt a lighter touch in some governance requirements and reporting, highlighting the value of good governance is a key message for us all to deliver during my presidency and beyond his presidency. The Institute is also midway through a review of the competencies that all governance professionals must possess to hold themselves out as true professionals. So we talked about the architecture of jobs and jobs changing as a result of the overall economic, political, and market pressures. So that being said, now that we've addressed the uncertainty in the market, we've talked about the impact for you as governance professionals, let's take another look broadly and understand, okay, we know all of this is happening. Let's take a minute and put in the chat, what are the different types of organizational changes that have come from all of these market and governance changes that are happening? So if you can take just a moment and type in some of the organizational changes that you may be seeing, not only in your company, but around you. I'll give you, yes, mergers. Mergers are huge. Again, expansion and contraction in the market, right? So we're seeing a number of mergers, reduction in staffing, absolutely. One organizational change that I have seen, I saw during COVID, was actually there was a supply chain strategy organizational change as the supply chain during COVID started to contract, and we had a lot of problems shipping in. So that's another example. Flattening hierarchy, reducing middle management, yes, cost cutting, change of work, mode from person to hybrid, that is also very interesting. So that goes into a whole new human resource strategy. And in fact, we're going to touch on the different types of components now that we're seeing in, who's making up the labor market and digital transformation. Yep, absolutely. And adopting AI. And we have to change faster and faster. It's not only the type of change that's happening and the speed, but it is the speed of change that is happening and the consistency. Lower cost centers, consolidating workflow, 0-hour contracts. Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. So we're seeing a number of these organizational changes. And now that we've discussed a number of ways that the organizations can experience change, let's explore some of the metrics that organizations are using to measure change successfully. So in the chat, and I know some of you have already put down specific, reduction and what when organizations go through these changes, what are some of the KPIs that they're using? What are some of the metrics to manage organizational change or to measure organizational change? Revenue, absolutely. Especially when we're talking about strategic change. Operational costs, yes, over and over again. Especially when we talk about, sometimes I've seen percentage in reduction of operational costs year over year. That has been big. Reputational costs, yes, that is, Patricia, very interesting. Percentage of adoption and implementation by employees. That is very interesting. Ease of doing business. Yes. Ease of doing business, and also on the flip side, speed to market. Speed to market. Many organizations don't share their metrics and aren't transparent with staff on these, or in some cases don't have metrics. Yes, I mean that is a very, very good point. That is an excellent point. Many, depending on the organization that you're working with, yeah, I mean there's many public companies that do or and have to share, but other organizations do not. That's a great call out. It's a good point. So let's pause here for a moment. So what we've discussed here is why organizations get involved in difficult organization changes. What are the requirements for them to change? Why are they changing? And we've discussed that from a market standpoint, specifically even a governance standpoint, and what you're seeing. And now we've discussed also too, what are some of the metrics that are used to measure change and how changes measured from a company standpoint. But that's only half the story. That is not the full story. So to change speed here a little bit, I'd like to share with you, and some of you may have already heard of this old Buddhist parable, but I'd like to share an old Buddhist parable with you just to give you an idea of why it's important to look at things from a different perspective instead of the same way that we've been looking at it up until now. So we are looking at a lot of organizations look at organizational change from only one perspective, right? So this parable is a great example of how we need to look at it from a number of perspectives. So in this parable, a group of blind men who are unfamiliar with an elephant were led to an elephant. Each each person was asked to touch a different part of the elephant, right? And one touched the side of an elephant and said, and they were asked, so what is an elephant? Oh, this elephant, it's a wall. It's a wall. I can feel only a wall. The other one was asked to touch the tusk. And so the person touched the tusk and said, oh, this feels like a snake. The other one feels like a sphere. The other one touched the trunk and said, this feels like a snake. The other one touched the leg and said, this thing you call elephant, it's actually a pillar. And the other one touched the ear and said, boy, this feels like a fan here. And the other person was led to the tail, touched the tail, and said, it's a rope. Yeah, that's what an elephant is. It goes to show you that the example of this illustrates the fact that we have limited perception when we only look at organizational change from one perspective. And it creates subjectivity. We're influenced by our own background, we're influenced by our own bias. So bringing it back to today's discussion, we are looking at measuring organizational change from the organization's perspective, not only from one part. We're only looking at it from the employer's part, but that's not the whole picture. Yes, each seem to draw from their own experience. That is absolutely, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. That's right, because they would have had to understand, okay, this is what a rope feels like. So that's a very good, thank you very much. A very good call out. So that's exactly it, coming with our own bias. Right. So let's try and look at the organizational change from another perspective. Let's look at organizational change. We've only been viewing it from a company's perspective, an organization's perspective. So let's try and view it from an employee's perspective. And when we look at organizational change from an employee's perspective, there's a few things that happen. First, we get a fuller picture of what is happening when we change the organization. We understand the implications of organization change actions. It helps us make better decisions when we're deciding the fate of the organization or how to even manage the organizational change. It mitigates some of the costly pitfalls of organizational change, and it manages the change process with effectively, because you're looking at it from holistically. Right? Because if we don't do that, then there's consequences. And I love this quote from Cotter. People change what they do less because they are given analysis that shifts their thinking, then because they're shown a truth that influences their feelings. This is especially so in large-scale organizational change. Handle it poorly, and it can drive you crazy, costs a great deal of money, and causes a lot of pain. So, I'm interested in your thoughts. If we were to measure change from an employee's perspective rather than from the organization's perspective, and I know we've talked a little bit about that, things like revenue are usually KPIs for organizations as they're going through organization changes. Wondering, and some of you have already addressed this with the employee's perception, but wondering if you have any other KPIs that you would care to share with us from in the chat that would be interesting to measure from the employee's perspective, if we were to measure change from the employee's perspective. I'll give you a minute before sharing a few that I have. Yes, it changes your work-life balance. That is very, very, very true. That is very true. That's very interesting. Again, I hadn't thought of that one. That's a brilliant call out. Job satisfaction, absolutely, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll touch on that. Increase in compensation, change in title or designation. So true when it comes. An increase in loyalty. Yes. And we'll actually touch on that when we talk a little bit about organizational citizenship behavior and the psychological contract. For employees, it's always a factor of how it impacts you. Yes. Change in workload, feeling less secure. Yes, that always, and we'll talk about that. Increased capability to form the function. Yes. Absolutely. There's capabilities, and we talked about the organization, your organization, um, looking at capabilities to navigate the uncharted waters that we're getting into. Okay, some of the ones that I came up with are are similar to yours. The employee sense of leaders' commitment, change of tone and communication. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about that. Change in title. Yes. So all of those things impact employees. Like there's this also the employee's perception of change, which can come from changes in titles, all those things that you've all called out. The measuring the employee's perception of the company, and we'll talk about why that's important. Cost implications and employee-centric measurements. For example, you'll see absenteeism, injuries. Somebody just mentioned here rumors versus reality. That impacts how employees feel about their job, how they feel about the company. And there's also measuring possible measurement is learnings that you get from this organization change and how it can translate into future change projects. And there's also measuring leadership. How do your leaders manage their leadership through this change? So those are some of the impacts, especially when we talk about the employee's perception of the company. And why is that important? Well, Deloitte's 2025 survey on Gen Z and millennials show that 89% of Gen Zs and 92% of millennials find purpose, influence, and motivation and engagement important to job satisfaction, as someone in our chat actually just mentioned, and well-being. So their survey showed that actually this group, Gen Zs and millennials, were more interested in the company they worked for, what they did for the world versus the actual products that they sell. So that is definitely a shift over the years. Why is this important? Well, by 2030, Gen Zs and millennials will make up 74% of the workforce. So if we think about it, what is important to our workforce better be important to us. So let's take a look at some of the theory behind organizational change. So Ludwig's three-step model of organizational change may seem so very basic, but it is so effective. When a change happens, there's an unfreezing. So we've had a state. The state has continued on. When a change happens, there's an unfreezing of whatever has been happening. That usually happens at the point of communication. And this is why communication is so important. Then there's this change happens, right? There's the feeling of being unstable. I think somebody put it down in the chat is no longer feeling like you're in control of your environment. There's a change happening. And then there's a refreezing, which is a stabilizing. And what happens if we don't do it right? If we don't do the change right, what happens? There's this, there is the concept of reciprocal deviance. And I'm going to actually show you very soon a very interesting example of this. But reciprocal deviance comes from the employee's perception that the employer has defaulted on their obligation. And we'll talk about that obligation in a second. Defaulted on that obligation, thereby encouraging them to respond with similar acts of deviance. So, how does deviance show up? So, deviance could be productivity, quality, absenteeism, safety, can even be vandalism and theft. It could be legal retribution. So we see that the employee's perception of deviance is actually overflowing into the company's KPIs. And so there's a really big interplay between the two. But what if we get it right? What if we're able to change and really speak to the needs of the employee? What will happen? Well, hopefully it will show up in organizational citizenship behaviors, which we'll talk about. That increase productivity, quality, decrease absenteeism, decrease safety incidents, hopefully no vandalism and theft or legal repercussions. So studies have shown that communication is key, employee well-being, and also career efficacy. So what does this mean? Well, in order to understand that, we need to understand the definition of the psychological contract. The psychological contract is a relationship between the employee and the employer that goes beyond money. So think about your own relationship with your employer. Is there anything beyond pay that keeps you with this employer? Loyalty, opportunity, maybe a sense of community. So this is all part of the psychological employment contract. And studies have shown that if there is a change in the employment relationship, it will change in the psychological contract. It will change the employee's behavior, right? And Rousseau has a 2001 paper that identifies that the breaking of the psychological contract can generate an intense attitudinal and emotional response from the employee. So we're talking about a lot of organizational change. We've mentioned it here: mergers, acquisitions, downsizing, losing of jobs, being bought out, or buying a company. All of this breaks the employment contract or the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. So what happens? The employee now has to redevelop their perception of what they consider is justice from the organization. And what that does is that will change the employee's practices. And what we just talked about is a bit of restorative justice and their thoughts on restorative justice, their organizational citizenship behavior. This is why it's so important. So let's back up. We talked about this idea of organizational justice. What is organizational justice? So organizational justice, there's 4 different types of organizational justice. There's distributive justice, where the employee, and it's always the employee's perception of the allocation of resources, where the employee perceives that the outcomes are consistent with implicit norms of allocation. Informational justice and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is the employee's perception of the depth and transparency of the knowledge that they receive from the organization. In the chat, somebody mentioned there are many companies that don't share their KPIs. There are many companies that don't provide that type of transparency. Well, that would fall under this idea of informational justice. The employees utilize the information they receive to evaluate the structural aspect of the decisions that they're being that are being delved out. Interactive justice is the employee's perception of the interpersonal relationship between the employee and their supervisor. So it's like that immediate, that leadership, that direct leader. It is the employee's perception of the fairness of the supervisor's decision making and the level of fairness and sensitivity that they feel when they interact with their immediate supervisor. Finally, there's procedural justice. This is the employee's perception of fairness of the organization's decision and how rules are applied. So I would like to share with you two studies. And I said we're going to get into some interesting case studies or interesting studies here. Greenberg has two studies, very interesting. The first study is based on a manufacturing company that had a number of plants. The Greenberg studied 3 of the plants. The first plant, due to tough economic conditions and cash flow issues, the first plant employees were asked to take a 15% cut in wages for a period of time. They were informed with a high degree of informational validity and high sensitivity. The second was asked to do the same thing, but they were informed with low information validity and low sensitivity. The third, there was no change, so that was the baseline. What Greenberg found is that the plant that was informed of their 15% cut was what happened there is that they experienced during that time 250% higher theft and turnover. So they were given an inadequate explanation and with little sensitivity, and this was the repercussions. Then there was another, Greenberg in 1993 actually did another study, and this is another very interesting study. Greenberg recruited 102 undergraduate students. So he had 6 groups of undergraduate students, and he said, you know what, I'm asking you to come in, perform a task. I'm going to give you $5 for that task. So the students came in, they start performing the task. Halfway through the task, the proctor came in and said, you know, we're no longer going to pay you $5. We're actually going to pay you $3. And when you finish your task, you know, I'm leaving the money here. It was all small denominations, quarters, nickels, like very small denominations. So when I finish here, pick up your money and then you can leave. And when you leave, please fill out the questionnaire outside. So what did they find? Well, they had the different groups. The group that had, when explained that they no longer are being paid $5, they're being paid $3. On average, the group that was communicated with sensitivity, there was, you know, I'm sorry that this is happening, and you know, that this is happening to you. There's a lot of sensitivity in the communication. The average person took $3.52, so 52 cents above the $3 that they were asked to take. The group that was given a high validity, their high validity in their information during that communication time, took on average 58 cents more than the $3. So $3.58. So they were told the reason, this is the reason where our budgets were cut or whatever the reason was, but a lot of information. But they took a little bit more. Then the group that was given a lot of information on why it happened, um, on sorry, the group that was not given information on why it was happening actually ended up taking $4.07. So not giving information, the employee or the student in that case felt that they could take $1.07 more than the $3. And the most costly was when it was communicated with very low sensitivity. The student or the employee was took $4.17. Right? Very, very costly. So this is just an experiment, but you can imagine how we can take that experiment and we can expand it to what we see in our companies. So the question is, how do we avoid that scenario? Let's look at communication. Okay. Researchers have found that when communicating, we have to make sure that we communicate that the decisions were made without bias, that they're going to be applied consistently, carefully justified based on adequate information. The decision maker has to make sure that they're communicating their ideas with honesty, and people are assured that higher authorities are sensitive to the employee's viewpoint. Employees are influenced by the decision that the employees influenced by the decision need to be treated courteous and in a civil manner. So those are some general important outcomes or basis for when you're communicating decisions. So remember I talked to you about the 15% cash flow issue where employees were asked to take a pay cut. Now, this was one example of the information that had low information and low sensitivity. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'd like you to see that this is like it's very short, the information, the communication that was given in person. And at the end, the offer was only to answer one or two questions before they had to catch another plane or leave. Now, you see, when looking at high information and high sensitivity, that the decisions are clearly explained and justified, that projections are verified um, on the reason for the pay cuts, that employees are assured this is not going to go on forever, that it's only for 10 weeks. And you can see that the whole communication is much more in depth. And the people communicating, the leaders communicating, were around for questions. So that being said, I want you to take away a few important principles. So when we're communicating, right, we have to make sure we pay attention to the employee's viewpoint. And the employee has to understand that all suggestions are carefully considered in decisions. Okay, and that we're communicating with them with high information validity. What does that mean? Well, it's showing that we have directly acquired information. It's from an expert source. It's publicly revealed. We're double checking it with a third party. We're sharing information that also is substantiated by a third party. Highly sensitive information means that we have repeated expressions of remorse, and that we either associate or disassociate with the outcomes depending on the information that we're giving. Either we're in it with them, or you know what, this is happening. We're going to try and make it as comfortable as we can, so that we can walk through it together. So let me give you an example of this, so that we can look at a case study from that I was involved in here. This is a scenario where there was a couple of plants in Canada that were closing down. There was production, an announcement. Between the announcement and the stop of production, there was a number of months. And during that time, production had to continue. So you can imagine, remember, we're talking about that freezing and unfreezing and then freezing again. Well, when you're announcing something, but you're asking people to continue production, continue to work, and until the end of production, it's that time is quite a difficult time. So some of the indicators of success, these are some of the KPIs of success at that time. But the question we were really asking is, can an employee's organizational citizenship behavior, and we talked a little bit about that organizational citizenship behaviors, all of those behaviors that are acts of cooperation, helpfulness, all of them that the employer may not pay for, but definitely impact all of the KPIs for the employer, but and for the employee, that those KPIs we're talking about in terms of change management. So we were wondering if the employer's organizational citizenship behavior can be maintained during that shutdown period by mitigating the employee's perception of organizational justice. Remember those organizational justice areas that we talked about, those four that we talked about. So what did we do? Well, this is just a timeline. So there was a measurement before announcement. There was an announcement of the plant closure. And remember, we were talking about the circles, right? So there was a breaking of the psychological contract. There was a decrease in organization perceptions of organizational justice. Therefore, there could have been a negative reaction from the employees, impacting all of those other areas that we talked about: productivity, quality, safety. And then there was these. Then in between, during the notice period, there was a bunch of mitigating actions to ensure that the employees' well-being was seen to, as well as their career efficacy, making sure that their career was that we were doing what we could to help them take control of their career for the future. And then there was a second measurement. This second measurement happened when the company closed. So what we did is we captured the communication with high informational validity and high sensitivity, as per Greenberg's suggestion. And we engaged in a number of mitigating actions. So we were seeing to the employee's well-being, which also too starts from communication. Communication was sent not only in English, but in the language that was prominent in that plant as well. So it was English, French, and also the other language that was being used. There was a psychologist on site during the announcement. EAP counselors were on site a couple of times, and documentation also was sent home on EAP. There was the organization funded a third-party employment transition service with an extended time, so that the employee could be transitioned from the closure to a new job. There was resumes reviewed, and there was even a career fair brought on site during the last month. The organization very purposefully continued training and initiated training on transferable skills. So these would be skills that people like first aid, fork truck, ensuring that everybody had a fork truck license, so that they could take those skills and it would assist them to find a job. And our findings. Well, it's interesting. So this is a couple of findings. One is the survey response rate went up. So before it was 69%, it went to 83%, which is a nice indication of the organizational citizenship behaviors. The overall scores that we would expect to decrease after an announcement did not decrease after announcement. In some cases, they even increased. So the scores of procedural justice, interactive justice, and organizational citizenship behavior. During the notice period, we found, and this may be very interesting for some of you who are going through some very difficult organizational changes right now, there is a stronger relationship between the perception of organizational justice, those four perceptions, and the employee's organizational citizenship behavior. So the minute that there was an announcement, there was that sensitivity to make sure that there was an increased sensitivity in terms of how they were going to behave towards the organization. And there was a change. There was a there was a change in procedural justice and organizational behavior. So the interaction between procedural justice and how people react and behave was increased. What this means is that people were watching how the companies, what procedures the companies were taking and how they felt towards those procedures during the notice period. And the results overall, we found that we maintained the company's KPIs. In fact, like safety stayed at zero. There were zero safety incidents, and schedule attainment actually increased slightly over the time. So just to sum up today, we discussed organizational change. We discussed the needs for organizational change from an overall standpoint to how our companies are reacting, the types of organizational changes, the measurements, which you had some great measurements that I'm going to take a note of, and some organizational changes from an employee's perspective. Why is that important, and how that funnels into the company's overall KPIs, and also to how we can mitigate negative consequences, and that's specifically through communicating with high information validity and high sensitivity, and ensuring that we are very mindful on implementing mitigating actions. Okay. And what I know, we have very limited time today, so I wanted to share with you a couple of books that I have found particularly helpful. Switch is a great book, as it talks about how to change when you're dealing with people, and it's quite informative and actually very interesting to read. The Heart of Change, Cotter's step-by-step model on how to engage in organizational change, is very good and very informative. And I believe this book here has some stories that you can that illustrate that. Change on the Run is a very nice little book, and it's if you're engaging in something and you just need a workbook or something to start this Change on the Run, this organizational change book, is a nice little book to pick up and just flip through and say, okay, here's a nice little worksheet that I can do to manage through this particular piece of change, or this particular change that I'm going to, the aspect of change. Okay, well, with that, I would like to finish off by thanking Dr. William Holmes for the opportunity to present to you today, and Victoria Thacker for her help and insight and partnership to be able to speak to you today. And now I believe we've got 5 minutes left, and I'll just open it up for any questions.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, you can throw them in the Q&A and we'd be happy to get those answered for you. I know Asha had said before the presentation that if at any point you do have questions after the presentation or anything like that, you want to get in contact with her, you absolutely can. She's happy to discuss after the fact. You can reach out to our info@cgiofcanada.ca email, and we'd be happy to provide that information to connect with her after the fact. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. I do see the slide with the book recommendations. Yeah, we can share that. We typically share these slides on the CGIC website. So if you check back in about a week on the CPD page, the presentation slides will be there. That was to Lana.
Th- Thank you. Feel free if anybody has any questions to reach out to me, and even reach out to me on LinkedIn. I can put my profile in the slides as well. But it was such a pleasure interacting with you today.
Perfect. Okay, so I don't see any questions, so I'll just end this off then. So thank you, Asha, and thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. I do look forward to seeing you all at the next CPD webinar. It's called From Tokenism to Transformation, Realizing the Power of Diverse Boards with Anuli Ospeth Ajagu on August 13th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern. So that's in about a month. You can find more information about this on our website or in our newsletter as per usual. We invite you to provide your feedback on today's webinar in our evaluation link, which will be sent tomorrow afternoon. The recording and presentation, like I said, will be on our YouTube channel and website within a week. And with all of that, once again, thank you, Asha. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon or rest of your morning. I think it's afternoon for everyone now. So, has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, everyone.